Hello, and welcome to RootsTech Connect. My name is David Ouimet, and I'll be presenting on the topic, I'm adopted, using DNA to find my biological parents. I'd like to quote from Walt Whitman's poem, Song of Myself. He said, I am large, I contain multitudes. And I don't know if Walt Whitman was prescient or not in thinking about DNA in the future, but certainly each of us are large and we contain multitudes because hundreds of your ancestors left their imprint within you in the form of your DNA, your genetic composition. You received half your DNA from each biological parent, and your biological cousins share some of your DNA, and they have family trees. So as you take DNA tests and you find cousin matches, you'll find that the cousin's DNA that matches with yours comes from the shared ancestors. And because your cousins have family trees, you can look at their family trees and figure out your ancestors as well. So let's look at the first few generations of your family tree and see what it means when you have a cousin match after taking a DNA test. If you're adopted and your father and mother are unknown, but you have the good fortune to match with someone who is a sibling, that means that you share parents. Very easy and very amazing when that happens. If, however, you get a match back that says that you're first cousins, then you most likely share a pair of grandparents. It may not be obvious which pair at first, and it may be a slightly different relationship, but usually it means that you share grandparents. If the match results come back and say that you're second cousins, then you likely share one pair of great-grandparents or a very close relationship to that. But it's not obvious which pair of great-grandparents is the one that you share in common. And so on as you go back through earlier generations. If you are a third cousin match, you know that that's roughly how you're connected to the person, but don't know exactly which pair of great-great-grandparents you have in common. So what does this look like if you were to look at all 23 pairs of chromosomes and you were to color them in? I'm showing the first 5 pairs of chromosomes, and I've got different colors assigned for different segments of my DNA. And these colors match specific ancestors in my family tree: Edward Tallman, Jakub Czeluszniak, Cordelie Robert, Horatio Wade, each with their own colors associated with colors that I've marked on the chromosomes. If you get lots of cousin matches and they have family trees, you can eventually start to see which ancestors you share in common and what DNA you've mutually inherited from those ancestors. And you can essentially paint your chromosomes. There's actually a physical segment of your chromosome that you've inherited from the same ancestor as your match. So that's what we start with, is the ability to take matches and their family trees and trace your unknown biological ancestry. So I'm going to illustrate this by a project I undertook in helping one of my cousin matches who was adopted to identify her mother. And the process that we went through is the same process you can go through if you're adopted, or even if a close generation ancestor is unknown and you want to know who was that biological ancestor. So these are the 7 steps. I'll go through them briefly. To identify the biological parents, first thing you do is clarify what you already know. Do you know anything about where the birth took place, or possibly the father or biological mother's surname? What's your starting point? Next is you take the DNA test and you interpret the test results from your genetic cousins and how you match with them. What you want to do is take a look at their family trees and make sure that they're accurate, make sure that they're complete, and make sure that you can review them to find potential ancestors. Then you look at multiple DNA matches, and where those trees interconnect, those people that are shared in common in their family tree are also in your ancestry. Then you trace the descendants of the shared ancestors until you get closer and closer to you. You may need to actually ask other people if they would take DNA tests to get a bit more information. But eventually, as you get closer and closer to you, you identify potential birth families. What we've done here is we've taken a very difficult problem, finding biological parents, and converted it to a much easier problem. Can we find some people back in time that we descend from? Tracing descendants is easier than breaking through a brick wall of unknown biological parents. So here's what I did working with my cousin Match. We clarified what she knew. She knew what year she was born, she knew where her mother went to college, and she had a pretty good idea of what her mother's maiden name was. Then I reviewed our closest cousin matches. I was looking for people who had the most DNA that they shared in common with me and my adopted friend. Here's what this review looked like. I was logged into 23andMe. The column that says you is me. The other column, the top is blanked out. That's my adopted friend. I've hidden her name for privacy reasons. And then each line, we have the relatives that are in common, that share DNA with both of us. So in the first row, you see DT is listed as my third cousin and my friend's fifth cousin. The next line, MM, is shown to be genetically my third cousin and a second cousin to my adopted friend, and so on. So you can see some of these relatives that we share DNA with are more closely related to me, and some are more closely related to her. The next step was to go through the family trees of these shared matches. What we're looking for is to fill out the trees as completely as possible so that we can see potential ancestors for my adopted friend. So I created trees when they were missing, I corrected trees, I validated them, I extended them for each shared match. So here's what it usually looks like. I'm on ancestry.com, I'm looking at all of the shared matches, and it says this person has no family tree. There's 8 people in this family tree, no people in this family tree. Very common that people taking DNA tests have not necessarily typed in their ancestry or even know their ancestry. So what you get to do is you get to research other people's family trees. Let's say they put a little tree in. You need to fill it out. You get to create their tree. You get to document each parent-child relationship. If you need help or you want some help, you can contact these cousin matches and see if they can provide you some information so you can help build their tree. You're always building other people's trees when you're doing research to discover biological parents. But one thing, you do not want to trust the trees. I think about the Wizard of Oz and the Haunted Forest and the witch's castles 1 mile away, and I'd turn back if I were you. Do not trust trees, but make them solid, make them correct. Do the research on other people's ancestry to fill out their trees. Now, let's say you've gone through this process where you're helping to look at shared matches and build out trees. You can have a tree for one match, a tree for another, a tree for another. Where do these trees connect? Wherever you see the trees intersecting, this would be the ancestor that all the descendants share in common, that they get the DNA from, that makes them so that their cousin matches, including a person who's adopted. And so you want to extend all the lines back sufficiently that you can find all the places where these trees overlap. So in the case of my shared DNA with my adopted friend and all of our relatives in common, I was able to learn that the first person that we matched with together descended from a Tallman line in my family tree. The third person descended from a Wade line in my family tree, and the 7th person also descended from a Tallman line in my family tree. So my adopted friend who has no family tree was able to rely upon my tree connecting with all of our shared cousins, and we found a few that connected very nicely. So I went in and looked at one of these matches and was able to validate their family tree and found that we were connected through an ancestral couple, Edward Tallman and Clarissa Wade. And once I had that nice connection with an actual couple of ancestors that we shared, I was able to validate that that couple was also in the ancestry of our other shared matches. That was the key, seeing this connection with Edward Tallman and Clarissa Wade. You'll recall that DNA matches that appear to be third cousins typically share a relationship with the same pair of great-great-grandparents. But at this point, we didn't know where in my adopted friend's family tree that pair of shared ancestors actually fits. Well, it turns out that Edward Tallman and Clarissa Wade were on her mother's side of the family. And so what we needed to now do is do descendant research so that we could figure out not just who her great-great-grandparents were, but who her mother was. Now, we want to trace the descendants of the shared ancestors until we get close enough that we can identify her mother in this case. Now, somewhere along that way, you may find that you need a little bit more detail. You may have traced a number of descendants. In fact, you may actually want to have some of those descendants take a DNA test to give you a little bit more information. We didn't need to do that because this turned out to be very easy for us. But I've often found that when you find an ancestral couple, you need a little bit more DNA testing. In fact, there's specific people you can identify that should take tests to help you home in on the biological parent that you're searching for. But what we did in this case was just get closer and closer because I had already traced many descendants of my ancestors, Edward Tallman and Clarissa Wade. And so I was able to get very close to my adopted friend's mother. In fact, here's what it looked like. I knew all of Edward and Clarissa's children. And one son in particular, when I looked at his children, he had a daughter who married a man with the right surname, the surname that my adopted friend believed was likely the surname of her mother. So it was very easy to see the names of all of the children of this couple. And when we looked at the children and we found one who likely attended the same college that my adopted friend knew her mother had attended, she reached out and contacted her and was able to meet her mother. This is the power of cousin matches helping you trace even your biological parent. So let me recap the 7 steps to identifying biological parents. First, you clarify what you know at the very beginning. Then you take a DNA test and interpret the results of all of your top genetic cousins. You're going to be filling out their family trees, documenting every parent-child relationship to have solid cousin trees that you can investigate. Then you identify the shared ancestry of the DNA matches, how these trees overlap, and where the common shared ancestors are. These are the people that you descend from. So you trace the descendancy of these shared ancestors generation by generation closer and closer to you. If you need a little bit more information, you identify other descendants who you'd like to invite to take the DNA tests to give you a bit more detail. And as you get closer and closer, you'll eventually get to where you have potential birth families. And that's where you'll want to choose how you want to reach out to them and see whether they are, in fact, your biological parents. So going back to Walt Whitman, as he sang his Song of Myself, his great epic poem, and was delving into how much he inherited from his ancestors, how much he is the embodiment of so many of them, he said, "Through me, many long dumb voices, voices of the interminable generations, voices veiled, and I remove the veil." And it's my hope that you will be able to remove the veil from your ancestors and see who they are and let their voices speak as you discover them. I wish you the very best as you use DNA testing to discover your biological parents. Thank you.